Well, Christina spoke about Iran, a Muslim majority country. Let me expand it to include the entire Muslim commonwealth and how it's being presented and represented to us. When it comes to the question of what are we talking about when it comes to Muslims and Islam, the first question is, how many Muslims do we have in the world? And the answer is we don't know because no one can count all of them, but at least we can presume or we have a conventional number, and it's 1.7 billion. If you try to translate it into percentage, it's almost a quarter of a population, and the demographic institutes, they predict that it's going to rise so that by some time it'll reach a third of the human race. It's a fairly big number, I have to admit. Now, when it comes to the countries that are Muslim majority countries, it's once again almost a quarter of all the world's countries. So it's around 50 plus if we think that it's about 200 countries that we have in the world, although we have a bit more. Now, many people believe that the demographic center of Islam is in the Arab world or in the Middle East. But then they are wrong. Hopefully none of you thought so. Because the demographic center of Islam is in South and Southeast Asia, with Indonesia being the largest Muslim country with over 220 million people who are Muslim, because not all the people in Indonesia are Muslim, but majority are. So it's just one country that has 220 million. Then if you go to Pakistan, which is fast approaching 200 million, then you have India, which is admittedly not a Muslim majority country, I have to make clear this, but it has in the range of 170 million Muslim population. And then Bangladesh, which is also around 170 million. So roughly counting, if we say Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, we already have 700 million people. If you add several other countries that contain either majorities or at least big numbers of Muslims, it's Nigeria with something like 90 million by now probably. Then of course Iran comes in with some 80 million and so on. So with 8 countries, you probably have half of the Muslim population. And only Egypt, Iran and Turkey, each with almost 80 million Muslims, are in the Middle East. So the majority of Muslims, of the world's Muslims today, don't even live in the Middle East. They live somewhere else. And you may ask yourselves, how much have you heard about those countries and the people living there? But on the other hand, of course, when we come to thinking about Muslims and Islam, I need to admit, and you probably would also go along, that there's ample reporting on Muslims and Islam. I mean, probably not a day passes without us hearing on Muslims and Islam, whatever that might be. I'm not suggesting necessarily all the bad things, but in general. So we might even say that believers of no other religion receive this much public attention as Muslims. Have you heard about Hindus or Buddhists recently? Some of you might have. Of course, if you search for them, you do find information. I'm not suggesting that there's no information. It's just that it's not sort of being forwarded to us. We don't sort of get it, even if we don't necessarily look for it. But what is interesting, that much of the information and reporting on Muslims is actually on a particular specific category of people who are associated with Islam, namely jihadis. If you retrace what you have heard recently on Islam and Muslims, it's about the bad people, or if you want, bad Muslims, and I don't necessarily suggest there could be bad Muslims. So I would say there's this paradox that purportedly increasing cultural awareness through this reporting and information and access to that information of and knowledge about Muslims and Islam in the West is in fact counterproductive, as it entrenches their stigmatization and othering. So the paradox is, we have so much information and reporting on Islam, we might presume we know now much better. Because if I asked you about Hinduism, you say, well, I don't know, I haven't heard anything, so I just don't know. Have you heard about Muslims and Islam? Sure, absolutely. So you know. And I don't think we know, I'm not saying you don't know, but we generally in the West know. So with the increase of reporting, the knowledge somehow seems not to increase. That's the paradox that I find. And the dilemma that I personally see is that the Western public, and you may decide whether you belong to that Western public, oscillates between two extremes of presentation of Muslims in Islam. On the one hand, we have what I have termed as the moral panic. All Muslims are, at least potentially, radical. Read, jihadis are representative of them, and then Islam is a religion of war, of violence, whatever you want, right? But then the other extreme is which I have termed as apologetic, it's, well, look, jihadis are not even Muslims. Read, real Muslims may not be radical, and Islam is actually a religion of peace. And I think we are in trouble here. If we see only those two extremes, whichever we choose, either jihadis are not only Muslim, but they are actually representative of all the Muslims and Islam, or jihadis have nothing to do with Islam and the real Muslims are completely different, I think then we miss the point, because then we see in black and white, whichever the two you consider to be black and white, and we don't get the point as to how complex, how colorful and fascinating the Muslim commonwealth, I might say, has become, if you want, but it also has been that way for a while. So a rhetorical question of who is what, or what describes Muslims in Islam? Who or what represents Islam and Muslims? Whenever we talk or hear talk of Muslims, a discussion, an analytical approach or whatever, we very often hear these convenient divides. Well, there are liberal Muslims, of course, versus conservative. And the liberal are probably the better ones, or at least we like them better. And they're, less troublesome. Then the modern Muslims, whoever they might be, and the traditionalists who are troublesome. And you could go on, rich versus poor, better educated versus less educated, urbanites versus provincials. But even worse, I would say, and I emphasize worse, is the convenient labels. Sunni versus Shia. I very often get asked by journalists, what we have been seeing, anywhere, Qatar, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or elsewhere, isn't that between Sunni and Shia? I say, it's so irrelevant. These labels are irrelevant. If you come to think about the Islamic State and the people it has been torturing and killing, if we say that the Islamic State is Sunni, if someone thinks so, then it's the Sunnis who suffer most. So it's so irrelevant. But even better, inverted sense, fundamentalists, extremists, Islamists, terrorists, whatever you want. We have these very convenient labels we go by. We're being socialized into them. And if I may use the social constructivism framework, we are led to believe that the labels, carry contents. And they don't very often, not always, but very often they don't. So what is it to be a Muslim today? Well, we could think along certain lines, dimensions, the classical dimensions of Islam, the legal schools. Some of you might be aware of these madhahib, as they call in Arabic, the legal traditions. There are a number of them. They have been around for 1,000+ years, and they're still there. The mystical dimension of Islam, and many of you might be familiar with it through the word or the title of Sufism. Those of you who have traveled to Konya might have seen Mevlevi dervishes, and they are just an example of Sufism. Folk Islam, the so-called living local Islam, of course we may talk of modernizing trends through westernization, secularization, all the way to the point of post-religiousness. It's very often, when we think about Muslims in Islam, we think along the terms, okay, Muslim, well, a believer. Can a Muslim be non-believer? Why not? Can Christians be non-believers, or at least not religious? And the answer is yes, why not? Of course, I have to admit, we may talk of fundamentalists, even Islamists, and jihadis. Yes, no denial that there are people whom we may call jihadis. But if you come to think about the numbers, how many of those very, very, really, literally bad people there might be out there? If we say it's 1%, remember, 1.7 billion, it's a fairly big number, 1%. I would say that if we could agree that there might be out there 170,000 jihadis, the people who are ready to kill themselves while killing the others, 170,000 people, this is a very big number. But if you translate into percentage, it's 0.001%. 170,000 100,000 is a big number, I have to admit. But percentage-wise, it's just a fringe group. So we have a funny share game here. The silent, rarely reported on majority, the legalists, the traditionalists, or whatever they are called, is there, and it's the majority, but we don't really hear about them that often. We never really hear about the minorities, about those alternative religiosities, or even, agnostics, maybe even apostates among Muslims. No, they don't count, although individually their groups might be small, but collectively they make a fairly big share, but we never hear about them. So who do we hear about? The jihadis. It's those people who have stolen the show, who have taken the seat of representatives of Islam and Muslims, all at the expense of all the other majorities and minorities together. And I find it a very big problem. No denial that there is this group, which is very problematic, which needs to be tackled and so on. That's it. But how come they have come to represent all the Muslim commonwealth? I don't get it. Well, I do get it, because it's in the media, on the lips of politicians, and so on. But then you feel that there's this inverted representativeness, where a very non-representative group actually, it might claim to be representative, but we go along and we actually entrust them with this, sort of leadership card or title, which they don't deserve. We know that. So, but where is the real problem then? I would say it's, of course, not so much in the volume of reporting. There's even too much information on Islam Muslims, isn't it? Or particularly on individual Muslims, a guy there out in the suburbs of Brussels who, used to play football, then he didn't play football, he used to eat something, then he didn't, and so on. It's like, do we really need that information? It obscures this bigger picture, which is, as I said, very colorful, very interesting, which may, not only may, but needs to be realized. And I'm glad Christina just showed you how she personally realized that the diversity, the difference even, if you want, which is out there. And those of you who have traveled to the Middle East and elsewhere, to the Muslim majority countries, you must have realized that the reporting on Muslims and Islam and your experiences probably diverge greatly. And this has been what I have been experiencing, traveling, living, and so on. And you think that it's two realities. So it's not so much about the volume as probably about the contents. And when I say contents, it's the target groups, if you want, the people who are being reported on. So it's about the contents, but also about the intention. And I always wonder, what is the intention on reporting on Muslims and Islam? Is it really to report on them, or is it to let the people get what they expect? So there's a nexus between expectations, or supply and demand sort of nexus, where people in the West seem to expect the news on bad Muslims. Now, if I told you about punk bands somewhere in the Muslim world, or about even Satanists in Morocco, or heavy metal bands and festivals in Iraq, I'd say, what is this? No, Muslims don't do that. They do. They do anything and everything. How come we allow ourselves to believe that we can be whatever we want, whatever we choose to be? And they, for whatever reason, don't know which reason, but they cannot be what they want. They can. And in fact, what is even more interesting, they are. It's only that we somehow mentally deny them that ability or capability to be what they might want to be, but they are. So what is it for us? It is to go out, maybe even physically, savor and experience that diversity of the Muslim commonwealth. And I don't suggest all of it is pleasant, no, but much of it is really very pleasant, nice, welcoming of us, and we should be welcoming of them. We need to go out there and be trustful of them so that they can be trustful of us. Thank you.